All right, today we're going to continue our discussion about psychological disorders and their treatments. So we'll start today with something that's fairly common, actually, in limited cases. I know that sounds kind of opposite there. Fairly common in limited cases. It's fairly common at a reduced stage. We all go through depression, but what makes it a disorder is the major depression. That's a little bit less rare. So let me give you an example here. Jim's been feeling down lately. He got fired from his job as a line cook and isn't sure what he'd like to do next. He knows he should try to find more work, but in this economy, it doesn't seem worth it to try. He's been sleeping later and later because he doesn't have much to do, and he's been feeling really tired. As he goes longer without work, he starts feeling sad. Jim tries to go out with friends, but they're all employed, and he finds them irritating to be around. They stop calling. Jim still hasn't found work and starts feeling like he never will, starts feeling worthless. And now he spends most of his day sleeping. He doesn't have the energy to cook, so he eats junk food all the time. So what's going on with Jim? Well, if you were Jim's therapist, what diagnosis would you reach? You might suspect that he's depressed because he mentions feeling sad. But feeling sad isn't enough on its own, though. We all feel sad sometimes. But Jim has also mentioned changes in his sleep and eating patterns. He's lost interest in hanging out with his friends and feels irritable with them. He feels worthless because he hasn't found a job yet. Furthermore, it seems that his depressed mood is preventing him from finding a new job. Jim is demonstrating most of the signs then of major depression, a mood disorder which affects 8% to 12% of people at some point during their lives. Jim does not have recurrent suicidal thoughts, and we'll talk about suicide later. Even so, since he has many other items of a depression diagnostic checklist, you might diagnose him as having a major depressive episode anyway. It's understandable that Jim would feel sad after losing his job. What makes Jim's experience major depression, though, are his other symptoms and their duration of longer than 2 weeks. Major depressive episodes are often set off by traumatizing events, in this case, Jim losing his jobs, or the death of a loved one. But it's a reaction that's beyond normal sadness or grief. Susceptibility to major depression is believed to have biological underpinnings. Low levels of serotonin and norepinephrine have been observed in depressed patients. There are also differences in actual brain structure. For example, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the hippocampus are all differently shaped in people who suffer from recurring depressive episodes. Interestingly, it's been shown that increasing serotonin levels in the brain can actually stimulate growth in the hippocampus, so it's possible that these things are actually related. Depression is associated with certain psychological traits, such as low self-esteem, general negative emotionality, a tendency to blame yourself for bad things that happen. It's also been associated with social isolation, and it's not clear whether social isolation causes depression or depression causes social isolation, but they are definitely related and tied in. Now let's talk about dysthymic disorder, and we're going to talk about Sandra. Now, nothing out of the ordinary has happened to Sandra lately. Still, she's felt unhappy for a long time with symptoms similar to Jim's, but milder. If you were Sandra's therapist, you might diagnose her with this dysthymic disorder. And this is a milder, more longer lasting form of depression. If you experience mild depressive symptoms for over 2 years, you might have dysthymic disorder. It's treated similarly to depression. So those are the depressive disorders. Now let's get into bipolar disorder here. I'm sure you've heard of that, and you probably have the pop culture vision of what bipolar disorder is. But let's imagine mood as a spectrum to explain this. We've got, the far left and the far right on this line, and your mood can go from totally depressed to totally euphoric, and then all the areas in between. So depressive and dysthymia both make people hang out for longer in the depressive end, but bipolar disorder is just what it sounds like. It makes people hang out not in between both ends, but at the extremes of both ends or poles of the mood spectrum. They have episodes similar to those in major depressive disorder, followed by periods of mania. And mania is characterized by feelings of being high, the decreased need for sleep, inflated self-esteem, fast speech, general agitation. And some extremely manic episodes can even have psychotic symptoms like delusions or hallucinations, but this is fairly uncommon. There are actually three kinds of bipolar disorder that vary in severity. Hanging out at extreme poles is bipolar 1. Less extreme is bipolar 2. You're hanging out in the two ends, but not all the way at the end. And least extreme is cyclothymia. Note the thymia there. It basically means mood or state of mind, and it's in dysthymia as well. And those two are both milder forms of acute mood disorders. Now, I said before that I'd come back to suicide, and this is because it's actually more commonly associated with bipolar disorder than depression. And this may seem counterintuitive. You'd think someone who is really depressed would consider taking their life to end it all, that they're not worth anything. But ironically, depressed people don't often commit suicide because it's just too much effort. They don't have the motivation to actually do it. So sometimes when they're being treated and started to come out of a depressed state, though, they do commit suicide. And this basically happens to bipolar people every time they switch their mood. Most suicide is committed during manic episodes. There are times when the human brain can actually separate its different parts. Sometimes it's a defense mechanism. And the brain's ability to do this is what brings us into the next classification disorder, dissociative disorders. And what does someone with multiple personalities have in common with someone with amnesia? The two conditions can seem very different. One has patients with distinct personalities living in the same brain, while the other causes patients to forget pieces of their lives. But both are categorized as dissociative disorders because the brain has separated certain sections of memory. The brain has separated into different aspects of a universal personality, creating multiple personalities. It has dissociated different parts of itself to be separate. So dissociative disorder is just a general term for disorders that cause disturbances in consciousness, memory, identity, or perception. So what's the common denominator between multiple personalities and temporarily forgetting your name and birthday? Essentially, dissociative disorders are caused by a given part of the mind dissociating itself from another part. And this means one part of the mind basically forgets or ignores another part. In dissociative amnesia, which is different than the kind of amnesia caused by injury or illness, the mind basically loses track of the part of itself that stores important personal information. I mean, you've probably had the experience maybe on a history test of being totally unable to remember something important. But patients with amnesia often don't even recognize that the lost information is missing. And they lose much more than simply what day the Civil War began or where their keys are. There are two main types of dissociative amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is when a patient forgets their past up to a certain point, but is able to form new memories. And this kind of patient would basically be starting a new life as a new person, functioning in most ways except totally unable to remember the past. And I've seen lots of cool movies where one of my favorites, Gina Davis was in. Oh man, what is the name of that movie? I can't remember, but Samuel L. Jackson is in it. And basically she forgets, after getting grazed in the head by a bullet, that she's an international assassin. And then later on, as she recovers her memories, she lives this life for like 20 years of this housewife. And then all of a sudden she recovers her memories and, people are out to kill her. Great movie. I think the same thing is in those Matt Damon movies, and I can't remember what they're called either. I have my own. My amnesia is old age, though. My amnesia is not based on anything like this. So retrograde amnesia, which literally means moving backward. Oh, I wrote it here. What do you know? It plays an important role in the movie The Bourne Identity. That was the Matt Damon movie I was trying to remember the title of, in which Matt Damon's character wakes up on a boat with no idea who he is and no memory of his military training. Anterograde amnesia is the opposite of retrograde and literally means forward moving. Patients with anterograde amnesia can't form new memories, but do remember everything before the amnesia set in. So you might remember in Dr. Sachs' book, The Submariner, basically he could remember everything in the past, he just couldn't remember anything new going forward. And this is true of Drew Barrymore's character in 50 First Dates as well, who quite literally goes on 50 dates with Adam Sandler that seem to her as if they're the first because she cannot form new memories. And though she knows who she is and remembers her past and her childhood, she wakes up each morning thinking she and Adam Sandler haven't met. Different from dissociative amnesia, but sharing the feature of memory loss, is a dissociative fugue, and also known as a fugue state. And it's when a patient completely forgets their personal identity temporarily, usually for a few hours or for a few days at most. And people in fugue states will often wander around and even attempt to set up new identities for themselves. A man in an extended fugue state might go apply for a new job, go on a date with a woman, find himself an apartment, all while his wife and children are frantically looking for him. I think this is the premise of the movie Overboard. I didn't see the new one, but the old one with Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn. Goldie Hawn's this rich woman, kind of a snob, and she falls overboard of her boat, hence the title of the movie, and is in a fugue state, thinks she's married to Kurt Russell, and lives in poverty and stuff like that. So fugue states are usually set off by environmental stressors like a traumatic event. And once the patient remembers who they are, memories of what happened during the fugue state are usually totally wiped, which didn't happen in the movie, which made her fall in love with Kurt Russell's character and so forth. But it's like it happened to somebody else, basically. It is in this sense that split or multiple personalities is related to the other dissociative disorders. I mean, imagine you speak two languages. And think about what it's like to switch fluidly from one language to another. Now imagine that each language is attached to a specific personality. And this is stranger, but some bilingual people do say that they think and behave slightly different in different languages they speak. In all honesty, you can get the same sense not from even just speaking a different language. The Doyles, my mother's side of the family, were an academic culture. My grandmother had a PhD. My grandfather was a union president, and they spoke with big words. The Kleins, love them, I'm not putting them down, but they're pretty laid back. They're, Kentucky Hill people. So when I go and speak with them, it's a lot different than hanging with the Doyles. There's certainly caused some friction between the families when my parents were going through the divorce, or I suppose even when they were married. But the Kleins taught me to be ready for an environment like the Army, where every other word out of my mouth is probably a cuss word. Whereas the Doyles kind of helped me prepare more for the academic professional setting that I'm in now. And sometimes, those two things cross, but trust me that, when I hang out with Army buddies, I'm probably a lot different than when I hang out with my students or with fellow faculty members. You just think differently, and it's almost like speaking two different languages. So now imagine that these personalities can't access each other's memories, though, and know nothing about each other. That's probably not something you have experience with, but it's what patients with multiple personalities experience. A TV show called The United States of Tara, if you want to look it up, I'm not sure if it's on anywhere, but it kind of explores this phenomena. A middle-aged mother of two transitions into other personalities when under stress, including Alice, a 1950s housewife, Buck, a male Vietnam War veteran, and T, a teenage girl. Matter of fact, while I have the technology, the benefits of being at home instead of at school. United States of Tara.
No results.
Well, it doesn't look like you could find it anywhere on TV. Maybe it's on YouTube or something, but it doesn't look like it's on any channel. Anyway, split personalities are formally known as dissociative identity disorder. And patients report that experiences undertaken by one personality are not remembered by the other, hidden away in another part of the mind in a similar way as the events of a fugue state. So that movie Split, M. Night Shyamalan, the character in there, all of his personalities are working together towards a common goal, know what the others say and things. That wouldn't really happen. Some patients' multiple personalities actually exhibit different patterns of electrical activity in the brain, like they are a completely different person. And that's fascinating in of itself. Others have patterns that are the same, so it's unclear whether this is truly a marker of the disorder. Now, split personalities are thought to be caused by trauma during childhood, by stress or insufficient nurturing. And a lot of patients even report physical or sexual abuse during childhood. One of the first early great psychological movies came out in the early 1970s and starred Sally Fields as a character named Sybil. And if we were in class, I'd actually probably put it on. I might be able to record it on here now that I think about it with Zoom and put it on there if you're interested in watching it. But Sybil was a character with multiple personalities. And she had suffered childhood sexual abuse from her mother when she was younger. So fascinating. And it was, at the time, it was purported to be based on a psychologist's real experiences with a patient with personality disorder. But since the 70s, it's kind of come out that a lot of it was fabricated. But it's still interesting to watch to see how they're doing that. So I might go to the school, grab that the DVD, and show it to you on here that you can watch on your free time because it's pretty interesting. But these disorders are still not entirely understood, and sometimes their diagnosis is controversial because, particularly in a criminal element, it's very easy to say, well, that wasn't me, that was Bobby, my other personality. And so sometimes it's seen as a way to get people off of, major sentences for major crimes or things like that. All right, let's move away from dissociative disorders into the next classification, which is somatoform disorders. And psychology is full of examples of how the mind and the body are connected. And when that connection is severed, what can go wrong? And we saw a lot of that in Dr. Sachs' book. Many psychological disorders produce negative bodily symptoms. Jim's depression gives him unexplained body aches, while Karen's panic disorder produces respiratory symptoms during attacks. And you've probably experienced something like this. Maybe anxiety gives you a stomach ache, or feeling sad makes your head hurt, things like that. Somatoform disorders take that idea of mind over matter to a whole new level, though. Patients experience symptoms severe enough to be mistaken for other physical disorders, for example, severe pain or even paralysis. But these symptoms have entirely psychological causes. This isn't the same thing as faking symptoms, don't get me wrong, or malingering is what they call that. Malingering patients with somatoform disorder really believe they're sick and often frightened by the symptoms they experience. So first, let's take a look at conversion disorder, which is a somatoform disorder with symptoms that at first seem neurological, weakness or paralysis of part of the body, impaired speech, seizures, tremor, difficulty waking. And it would be pretty scary to experience any of these symptoms. Patients and doctors alike often think they're dealing with something really dangerous like a stroke and will treat it as such. So sometimes it might take years for you to figure out that this is something psychological and not necessarily something physical. In order to diagnose conversion disorder, doctors have to eliminate conditions like strokes, multiple sclerosis or MS, epilepsy. And as these more common causes of symptoms are eliminated, a psychological explanation becomes more and more likely. But how and why does a patient's mind do this to the body? Freud thought that the body converted, hence the name conversion disorder, anxiety into physical symptoms, which were described at the time as hysteria. And typical of Freud, these anxieties were thought to come from repressed memories or desires and those things that we actively try not to think about. Modern psychologists tend to think it's more likely to be a kind of dissociative disorder or a condition in which the mind splits itself into more than one piece. And in cases of paralysis due to conversion disorder, these psychologists think that the mind basically ignores the part of itself that deals with the affected limb, leading to lack of sensation. So much as the mind is able to segregate itself into different personalities and split personality disorder, it should seem no stranger, and perhaps it seems a little more plausible, that the mind is able to segregate itself from a hand or a foot, or in the case of the patient who thought the leg wasn't even his own leg. Now, conversion disorder has a variety of potential symptoms, and some patients, however, just simply experience pain. So pain disorder is another somatoform condition characterized by debilitating pain that does not have a physical cause. And many of these patients have just experienced real pain from an accident or illness, but the pain either never subsided or returned even after the underlying cause of it had been dealt with. Normal physical pain is caused by nerve signals that the brain has to process. And because of this, pain is actually always created in the brain. And therefore, it is possible for the brain to create pain without physical trauma. And those are the disorders I was going to talk about today. So do you guys have any questions about any of those? So I'll tell you what I'll try to do is over this weekend, I'll try to get Sybil into a MP4 format and out on my website, so that if you do want to watch it, feel free. Also know that Awakenings is out on my website. If you ever want to watch it, it's, you know, out there. So otherwise, I guess I won't see you guys till Tuesday. Enjoy the rest of today, because I think this weekend is supposed to get down to like winter weather again, like down in the low 30s. We're under a freeze warning. So if you guys don't have anything else, have a good weekend.